What if I told you that the most dangerous shelter mistake isn't building the wrong structure, it's what you do inside it? For more than a century, survival stories from the American frontier have focused on how settlers built their shelters. But there's a hidden chapter to these stories that historians almost never mention. The shelters that saved lives weren't always the ones that looked the best or took the longest to build. They were the ones that taught people how to think differently about staying alive. And that difference between a shelter that keeps you warm and a shelter that actually saves your life? It's almost invisible. In 1881, a Montana pioneer named James Whitmore got caught in what locals called a white hurricane, a blizzard so fierce that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. He had shelter. He'd built a solid dugout into a hillside with a thick roof. By all the survival rules of the day, he should have survived the night. But James died in that shelter, froze solid while lying on a bed just 10 feet from his fire. His body wasn't found until spring, and when the search party entered that dugout, they found something strange. The fire had been burning, the shelter was sealed tight, and yet, somehow, James had become a block of ice. What killed him wasn't exposure. It wasn't bad construction. It was something happening inside his own mind that nobody in his settlement could explain, and almost nobody today understands either. This is the story that changes everything about how you think survival shelter actually works. Because the real forgotten tricks weren't just about building structures. They were about understanding a psychological trap that would claim more settlers than any blizzard, any predator, or any winter cold. And the worst part? Almost every modern survival guide, almost every YouTube video about wilderness shelter completely misses this problem. The frontier settlers called it shelter fever, not the fever you get from sickness, something darker. It was the moment when a shelter stopped being protection and started becoming a tomb. It happened when someone retreated into their shelter and forgot one fundamental rule. A shelter that keeps you alive is not the same as a shelter that lets you live. The difference is invisible. It's psychological, and it killed just as many people as the cold ever did. The settlement records from Dakota Territory between 1878 and 1895 tell a strange story. If you look at the death records from extreme cold, you'll see something that puzzles modern survival experts. People died in well-built shelters. People with food, with fire, with every protection theory said they needed. But the deaths clustered in a specific pattern. They happened around day 3 or day 4 of being sheltered. Not day 1, not after a week, days 3 and 4. Someone survived the initial exposure, made it to shelter, got warm, and then something switched off inside their mind. The settlers didn't have names for clinical depression or seasonal affective disorder, but they understood the pattern perfectly. A settler who went quiet, who stopped feeding the fire, who lay still in the darkness even though heat was available. That settler was in danger not from cold but from what cabin fever looked like when you were genuinely trapped. And the forgotten techniques to survive this weren't about insulation. They were about behavioral engineering. They were about forcing your mind to stay active, engaged, and fighting for survival even when every instinct told you to give up. Let me walk you through what the survivors actually did. What the people who made it through the brutal winters, not just physically but psychologically, had learned. The motion protocol. This was the first unwritten rule. In a surviving settlement, you never sat still for more than 30 minutes at a time. Never. A man or woman who built a shelter and then lay down to wait out a storm was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. So the survivors created constant motion. They maintained the fire in a specific pattern, not because they needed the heat, but because the motion of gathering wood, the physical act of feeding flames, the small decisions about how to arrange coals, these things kept the brain engaged. A settler who moved his body in regular patterns stayed alive. A settler who was stationary would slide into that psychological fog where survival stopped mattering. The motion had to be purposeful. It had to engage the hands and the mind together. Mindless pacing didn't work, but maintenance work, constant, repeating, necessary work that worked. The inventory system. Survivors kept meticulous records of everything in their shelter. How many pieces of wood remained? How many days of food? How much water was available? Some people think this was just practical planning, but it wasn't. The act of counting, measuring, and writing, or scratching marks into wood if no paper was available, forced the brain into a different state. It transformed waiting into active problem solving. A person who counted their resources every morning and evening had given their mind a job. A job meant you were still alive, in a way that mattered. A job meant the day had structure, and structure prevented the slide into that dangerous psychological state where hope simply evaporated. The thermal cycling strategy. This is where modern survival science completely diverges from what actually kept settlers alive. We're taught that a shelter should maintain constant temperature, that warmth equals survival. The settlers who lived understood something different. They deliberately cycled through periods of activity in colder areas of their shelter, then returned to warm zones. This wasn't about toughening up. It wasn't about building resilience. It was about preventing something called shelter adjustment breakdown. What happens to your mind when external conditions stay the same for too long? Your brain stops registering change. Time stops meaning anything. A person in a constantly warm, safe shelter begins to lose the sense that they're in danger, that they need to survive. But a person who regularly moves between warmer and cooler areas, who feels the change in temperature, who is forced to adjust and readjust, that person remains psychologically anchored in reality. They remember they're alive. They remember they're trying to survive. The isolation prevention ritual. The worst shelters were the ones where a person was alone. This seems obvious to us, but the forgotten technique here isn't about finding other people. It's about what to do when you're definitively alone. Survivors would engage in what they called talk work. They would literally speak aloud, describing everything they were doing, planning, thinking. A settler alone in a shelter would narrate their day. Now I'm adding 3 more sticks to the fire because the warmth is dropping. Now I'm checking the north wall for drafts. Now I'm reviewing my food supply. Modern psychology calls this externalized thinking. The settlers just called it staying sane. The act of speaking aloud, of hearing your own voice in the silence, prevented the psychological state where your mind folds in on itself. Silence is dangerous when you're isolated, not because silence makes you afraid, but because silence allows your brain to stop functioning in the way it needs to for survival. A voice, even if it's only your own, keeps the survival response active. The temporal anchor system. Here's something that seems strange to modern people but was absolutely critical. Settlers in extreme conditions would mark time obsessively. They would carve marks for days. They would track the position of light through cracks in their shelter. They would measure time in tasks rather than hours. Why? Because one of the most dangerous states a sheltered person can enter is temporal disorientation. When you're isolated, warm, and safe, time begins to slip. Days blur together. Your brain stops processing the fact that you need to get out, find help, or maintain your shelter. But a person who is actively tracking time, who understands exactly how many days they've been sheltered, who can see the progression of survival through marks on a wall, that person stays oriented. They remember there's a world outside. They remember they want to return to it. The deadliest shelters weren't the poorly built ones. They were the comfortable ones, the ones where nothing forced you to stay engaged with the fight to survive. A dugout that was too warm, too dark, too quiet. That shelter killed people just as effectively as an exposure to open winter. And the settlers who survived the longest, hardest winters weren't necessarily the best builders. They were the ones who understood that survival isn't about being safe. It's about staying alive in your mind while your body is safe. There's a theory that's been floating around academic circles for decades but hasn't reached mainstream survival education. It suggests that between 15 and 30% of deaths attributed to exposure during frontier winters were actually psychological. People who had shelter, food, warmth, and fire, but somehow lost the will to survive. The shelter didn't fail them. Their mind failed them. And the way to prevent that failure wasn't through better construction techniques. It was through psychological discipline embedded into your shelter routine. The techniques that actually kept people alive weren't in the architecture. They were in the behavior. Every ritual, every purposeful movement, every deliberate marking of time. These were survival technologies just as important as thatch or log placement or fire reflectors. Because you can build the perfect shelter and still die inside it. And you can build a terrible shelter and live, as long as your mind stays engaged with the work of survival. When historians went back and examined settlement records more carefully, the journals, the letters, the oral histories passed down through families, they found consistent patterns in who survived and who didn't. And it wasn't the strongest people. It wasn't the people with the most supplies. It was the people who treated shelter as an active challenge rather than a passive retreat. The people who gave their minds constant work. The people who refused to let comfort become complacency. One woman in Nebraska, documented in a 1902 account, survived a 3-month isolation in her cabin by establishing what she called her daily practice. She would reorganize her supplies every morning. She would walk every section of her shelter and check for damage. She would narrate her actions aloud. She would carve marks for each day. She would cycle between warm and cool areas. When rescuers finally reached her, They expected to find someone broken down by isolation. Instead, they found a woman who had become mentally sharper, more organized, more disciplined. She hadn't just survived the shelter, she had used the shelter to sharpen her mind. This is information that if you look hard enough, you can find in the original journals and settlement records. But it's been almost completely filtered out of modern survival education. We teach shelter construction. We teach insulation values. We teach material selection. But we don't teach the psychological framework that actually kept people alive. And that's a massive gap. If you want to understand the real story of shelter survival, there's a deeper dive available in the description. I've linked research into historical settlement records and the psychological patterns that emerge from actual survival situations. That's worth exploring if this is hitting something real for you. The practical application of all this becomes clear when you understand what it means. If you ever find yourself sheltered and isolated, whether it's from a blizzard, a broken-down vehicle, an injury that keeps you stationary, anything, your actual survival depends less on what you built and more on what you do inside it. Your mind is the real shelter. The structure is just the container, and a container can only protect you if you actively stay alive inside it. The motion, the inventory, the thermal cycling, the talk work, the time tracking, these aren't optional additions to shelter survival. They're the core techniques. They're what separates people who survive sheltering situations from people who retreat into shelters and psychologically check out. And that distinction is the difference between being found alive and being found frozen in a perfectly adequate shelter. The reason this knowledge faded from mainstream survival education is partially because it's uncomfortable. It's easier to teach people to build a better shelter than to teach them how to maintain psychological resilience in isolation. It's easier to focus on external techniques than internal discipline. But the settlers didn't have the luxury of avoiding the uncomfortable truth. They understood that a shelter was only useful if it also protected your mind. Modern survival culture has largely abandoned this insight. We've focused so heavily on gear, on construction, on material science, that we've lost sight of the human element. The element that actually determines whether you live or die when you're inside four walls waiting for rescue. The settlers who survived didn't have modern sleeping bags. They didn't have engineered insulation or weather-resistant fabrics. But many of them had something better. They had an understanding of their own minds. They knew that comfort without engagement was deadly. They knew that safety without purpose was dangerous. They knew that the real shelter wasn't the physical structure. It was the mental framework that kept them fighting to survive, even when safety was already achieved. And here's what that means for you, today, in a world where we think we're safe in different ways. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need to shelter, whether it's a worst-case scenario or just an extended isolation, the physical shelter might work perfectly. But without the psychological techniques, without the deliberate engagement and the purpose, you might still face the same challenge that killed settlers in their well-built cabins. Your mind needs work, your body needs motion, your consciousness needs markers of time and progress. Your voice needs to be heard, your sense of control needs to be actively maintained. These aren't luxury survival techniques, they're foundational, and they were learned through the hard experience of people who survived when they should have died, and died when they should have survived. The forgotten shelter tricks weren't just about building better structures. They were about understanding that survival is a mental game played out in a physical space. The settlers understood this at a level we've largely forgotten, and that understanding is available to us now, if we're willing to look back at what actually worked. There's something else these techniques teach us that we almost never discuss. It's about adaptation. See, the moment a settler arrived in a new region, they didn't have access to what worked back home. The climate was different. The materials were different. The threats were different. So they had to observe. They had to test. They had to fail in ways that sometimes meant the difference between a winter survived and a grave dug in frozen ground. The pine bough bed we talked about in the first part, that wasn't invented by one person. It evolved. Someone tried layering branches horizontally. That didn't work well. Someone else tried standing them upright. Also terrible. It took generations of cold nights and careful observation to discover that tips down, butts buried, created the exact amount of airspace needed to separate your body from the ground without compressing too much under your weight. And here's where it gets interesting for survival today. We assume that forgotten techniques are forgotten because we found something better. But often, they were forgotten because they required something we no longer have: time, attention, and community knowledge. Modern shelters are designed for people who can buy them. Forgotten shelters were designed for people who couldn't afford to fail. The snow banking technique mentioned earlier isn't just insulation. It's a lesson in paradox. The thing that kills you, snow, cold, exposure, becomes the thing that saves you, if you understand its actual properties. Snow packed tight around a cabin wall raises internal temperature by 10, sometimes 15 degrees. That's not magic, that's physics, but it required someone to think counterintuitively, to see snow not as an enemy, but as a tool. We live in an era of extreme specialization. We have tent engineers, we have sleeping bag manufacturers, we have gear reviewers, with million subscriber channels, and that's fine. Those things have value. But somewhere in that specialization, we lost something crucial. The knowledge that you can survive without any of it. A settler with a shovel could handle a blizzard that would kill a modern person with $5,000 of equipment if that modern person panicked. Why? Because the settler had been taught from childhood that the responsibility for living belonged to them. They didn't own their survival. They created it. Every night they made the choice to build what kept them alive. The debris hut is still one of the most effective shelters you can build in an emergency. A 3-foot layer of leaves, ferns, and forest debris insulates better than many commercial blankets. Military survival instructors still teach it, though most civilians don't know about it. It's simple, it works. It requires nothing but time and material that's literally everywhere in a forest. But here's the issue. Building a debris hut takes energy. Building it right takes skill. You have to understand exactly how thick the insulation needs to be. Too thin and you freeze. Too thick and you've wasted critical energy. The people who survived knew this. The people who didn't know usually died. The lean-to with a fire reflector is perhaps the most elegant shelter design ever created. A single slanted wall facing a fire. A reflector wall across the fire bouncing heat back. Open to the elements on one side, but positioned so the fire does the work that a tent would do. Mountain men preferred it to tents, because tents trap condensation from your breath, making the interior damp. A lean-to stays dry while keeping you warm. But again, this requires understanding. You have to know that green logs reflect heat better than white-hot stones. You have to understand angle and distance. You have to know how to arrange materials so they throw heat efficiently. It's not complicated, but it's not intuitive either. It's learned knowledge. The sod house banking technique spread across the Great Plains because it worked. Families would pile soil and sod against the outside walls in autumn, creating an earthen barrier. In spring, they'd remove it. But in winter, that barrier could raise internal temperatures by 20 degrees. Sod contains air pockets. Air is insulation. Again, taking something that seems like it would make things worse and understanding its actual properties to make things better. If you look back at all these techniques, there's a pattern. They're all about understanding that your environment contains everything you need if you know how to see it. The frozen cow manure story from earlier. That wasn't random desperation. Lena Olson understood something fundamental about insulation and protection. Her neighbors either didn't understand it or panicked before they could apply it. And here's where this becomes relevant to modern life, in ways we don't often discuss. We've outsourced our survival to systems. We trust that heat will come from the thermostat, that shelter will be provided by landlords or mortgages, that food will arrive from supply chains. That's not inherently bad, but it means that we've lost the knowledge to do these things ourselves, and we've lost the confidence that comes from knowing we could if we had to. The forgotten shelter tricks were forged in conditions where that confidence was necessary. Where the thermostat doesn't exist and the supply chain has collapsed, and you are standing in a forest at sunset with a few tools and the question of whether you'll be alive in the morning. These techniques teach something deeper than shelter construction. They teach that you are capable of more than you think, that your mind, your hands, and your awareness can solve problems that seem impossible. That observation and patience and willingness to learn can overcome circumstances that seem to guarantee failure. The settlers didn't have YouTube survival channels. They didn't have forums where they could ask questions. They had observation, experience, and community knowledge passed down verbally. Someone showed you how to build a pine bough bed, or you learned by watching someone else get through a winter while you didn't. That knowledge still exists. It's in old journals, it's in historical records, it's in the memory of people who grew up with it, and it's encoded in the logic of these shelter techniques, waiting to be understood by anyone willing to look carefully at how they actually work. There's a deeper layer here that we need to acknowledge. The people who developed these techniques didn't have an option to fail repeatedly until they got it right. The stakes were too high. Your first attempt at a debris hut might be your only attempt. That pressure forced a kind of precision and attention that we rarely see in modern learning. There was no room for half measures. And that attention to detail, that willingness to get something exactly right because the alternative was death, that's still embedded in these techniques. When you study how to build a lean-to correctly, you're not just learning construction. You're learning a way of thinking, a way of approaching problems with the assumption that precision matters, that details matter, that understanding the why behind a technique is as important as knowing the what. Modern survival gear is designed to be forgiving. A sleeping bag works even if you don't know much about insulation. A tent works even if you don't understand the principles behind its design. But a debris hut won't work if you don't understand insulation. A lean-to won't keep you warm if you don't position the fire correctly. The forgiveness is gone, and that forces you to learn the actual principles. If you want to explore these techniques deeper and actually learn how to build some of them yourself, I've put together a detailed resource guide that goes into the step-by-step construction of the 5 most effective forgotten shelters. You can find it in the description and in the pinned comment, where we go much deeper into the specific measurements, materials, and techniques that you need to know. But here's the thing that really matters. These techniques don't require expensive equipment or advanced training. They require observation and intention. They require you to stop for a moment and think about what your environment is actually offering you. They require you to understand that you are more capable than you think. The settlers who survived had one massive advantage over modern people. They had no illusions about their situation. They were not safe. They were not certain of survival. That clarity forced them to pay attention in ways we've forgotten how to do. If you take nothing else from this, take this. Your body loses heat to the ground faster than to the air. Every shelter technique from the past 100 years starts with that single fact. Insulate yourself from the ground, and you've solved more than half your problem. Add a windbreak and a heat source, and you've dramatically increased your chances. Add the right mental approach, intention, observation, willingness to learn, and you're no longer just surviving. You're adapting. The forgotten shelter tricks weren't forgotten because they stopped working. They were forgotten because we stopped needing them. We built systems that work without them, but those systems are increasingly fragile, and the skills are increasingly rare. And the moment something disrupts the supply chain, the thermostat, the certainty of modern survival infrastructure, those forgotten techniques become immediately relevant again. More importantly, knowing these techniques does something to your psychology. It gives you a baseline of confidence. You know that you could build a shelter. You know that you could stay warm. You know that your body and mind are capable of solving real problems. That confidence changes how you move through the world, even when you're sleeping in a comfortable bed in a heated home. If you want to take this further and start building these skills practically, whether it's just understanding the principles or actually spending time building shelters in nature, the detailed resource guide in the description and the pinned comment has everything you need to get started. It includes not just the techniques but the reasoning behind them, so you understand the why that the settlers knew intuitively. The forgotten shelter tricks are a bridge to a way of thinking that we've largely lost. They're a connection to people who solved real problems with real consequences. And they're a reminder that capability, when it's truly needed, often comes from returning to fundamentals, from understanding materials, from observing what actually works, from being willing to get the details right because your life depends on it. You don't need to become a frontier settler to benefit from this knowledge. You just need to understand that you're more capable than you think, and that the natural world around you contains more resources than you realize. The settlers knew that, and now, so do you. Thank you for watching all the way through. If this resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss these deeper dives into how humans solve real problems. Hit that like button if you found value in this, and activate your notification bell so you're always the first to know when we upload something new. There's always another story about survival, adaptation, and human capability waiting to be told, and I hope you'll be here to hear